Eamon Khan here for Seconds Out. Pleasure to be joined by renowned journalist Dan Rafael, whose Substack you can find at www.danrafael.substack.com. Link in the description. Dan, I appreciate you jumping on at short notice, given a whirlwind few hours in the world of boxing, which leaves our previous chat about Dubois versus Parker redundant. But we have a new conversation to talk about in the form of Joe Parker versus Martin Bakole. First of all, your reaction to that fight?
Amazing save. I mean, props to everybody involved. I mean, it's hard to make this type of fight, even if they had months and months to do it. This, if they had made this match as part of the original card, fans would have been like, "Oh, that's a hell of a fight, Parker versus Bakole." So to be able to put it together on a couple of days' notice after, unfortunately, Dubois comes down with an illness, and you are able to get Parker to take the fight and get Bakole to take the fight on that kind of notice. Bakole's flying. I know he based out of Scotland. He's from Congo. My understanding, he was in Congo. In flying like what, 2,000 to 2,500 miles, hours on a plane to get to Saudi. It would have been a long trip if he was coming from Scotland also. But he's going to be there sometime on Friday. 24 hours ish before he's supposed to get in the fight in the ring to fight. How could you not give respect to a guy to take a fight on that kind of notice? Now he's a heavyweight, doesn't have to worry about making weight. But I don't know if Martin Bakole's been in the gym in boxing condition, training for fights, but he's ready, willing, and able. He's a big man. It's a big change for Parker to go from an opponent like Dubois to take on a guy who is a good heavyweight also, but different dimensions, different assets compared to what Dubois has, different negatives compared to what Dubois has. And that's what Joe has been laser focused on for probably the last couple of months. Now, the good thing, he's got a great trainer and a great tactician and a great boxing mind like Andy Lee to go over and develop the game plan. He'll have a couple of days to do that. And I've got faith in Andy's ability to do that. And, Martin Bakole is not going to show him anything he hasn't seen before, but he's a big, strong guy who's fearless. That's why he's taking this fight. I'm so happy that they got a really good opponent to replace him. That it just, it's unfortunate for Dubois, but it doesn't detract from the card. It may not be for the, for the fight that we've all been talking about over the last, couple of months, but it's still a high level fight.
Of course, we wish Dubois speedy recovery as to what the illness is, but have you heard anything as to his situation at the moment?
Just that he was feeling ill. I mean, it is kind of the flu has been going around, or if those flu type illnesses, viruses, and such that have happened all over the place. I mean, I've been fighting it. It's a common kind of thing. So, if you're not ready to fight, you're not ready to fight. That's all there is to it. I mean, anybody that suggests that somehow Dubois was looking to duck Joe Parker or anything like that, I find to be ridiculous because he's been in training camp for the last couple of months, getting ready for the fight. He is coming off his biggest victory ever in terms of the amazing knockout he had against Anthony Joshua. So, shit happens. I mean, the same thing happened with, unfortunately, with Floyd Schofield, who was supposed to fight Shakur Stevenson for the lightweight belt on this undercard. He got sick, and British Boxing Board of Control, which regulates these cards, pulled him off the show, and they did get another opponent to fight Shakur Stevenson and Josh Padley. But no offense to Josh, but that's not at the same level, let's say, as Martin Bakole taking the fight against Joseph Parker.
What's your anticipation of the fully fit, 100% firing version of Martin Bakole we're going to see in the ring on Saturday?
That's impossible for me to know. I mean, like I said, I have no idea if Bakole has been in the gym at all in terms of, forget about preparing for a fight because he didn't have a fight coming up, but even in boxing condition or in condition in general, Martin's a big guy. And, sometimes maybe if you haven't been training, like you're not going to maybe have the stamina or the sharpness that you would have if you've been through, a normal training camp where you've been sparring and you've been preparing and conditioning yourself for the fight, maybe studying video and, listening to your trainers. But that's one of the things that makes it sort of exciting in one sense, because it's the element of the unknown. I mean, there's been no preparation at all. He won't even get in probably. I mean, he'll shake out. I guess he'll do a little pad work when he gets there. He won't have one sparring session. I can't imagine. When's he going to spar? There's no time. It's a long trip to fly into Saudi Arabia. Once he gets there, he'll have to, do his normal medicals and that kind of stuff. I mean, and I don't think there's time to do sparring. Plus, why would you risk, some type of sparring injury, a cut or something like that, literally a day before the fight? That's not going to happen. So he's going into this fight unless he's been sparring in the gym, which I don't know the answer to. I don't think he probably has been because he doesn't have a fight coming up. So was he just sparring to spar? I don't know about that. So either way, he's not in the I can't imagine he's in boxing condition, but his physical strength, mindset, power, chin, that type of stuff can maybe overcome some of the things that would be that you'd be preparing for. And for Parker, like I said, it's a big, but he's been in training camp. He's been preparing for a fight for a while, getting ready to challenge Dubois. And okay, he's got to make a change. It's a kind of a radical change, as I mentioned, but it's still whatever conditioning he's been through, whatever sparring he's been through, he should be good to go.
Yeah, how much of the blueprint of the game plan can Andy Lee and Joe Parker take into a fight from Daniel Dubois now into Martin Bakole?
I think that's a hard thing to say because Martin Bakole is such a big guy compared to Daniel Dubois. I mean, Bacole's taller than Dubois. He's going to be much heavier than Joe Parker. It's a whole different animal. He's a lot slower than Daniel Dubois. Like everything about the fight, in terms of like the metrics, let's say. I mean, the fight's the fight when you're punching guys and they're hit. That's the same thing. But in terms of what you're looking at, the angle that the punches are coming from, maybe the video that you've studied, all the time and effort you've put in to preparing for a particular opponent, that has to now change because they're much different fighters. I mean, the good thing is it's not like he's switching from like preparing for a right-handed fighter to a left-handed fighter. The saving grace here is they're both right-handed fighters. So from that perspective, it shouldn't be that much of a change in terms of what you're looking at. But again, it's a big difference looking at a big man like Martin Bakole compared to Dubois, who I can't say is a small guy, but he's certainly smaller than Martin Bakole is.
Last thing I wanted to ask you, before Bakole was finalized and settled upon, the rumors were that it could have been Bakole, could have been Adelaide, or could have been Alayev. Do you feel that they've settled on the best choice in terms of the prospect for the fans and the fight as a whole?
Well, in terms of the name value and where Martin is in the division, absolutely, it's the best of those names you mentioned, who are not on the same level in terms of recognition, or even in the heavyweight division in terms of accomplishment. A spectacular victory in August that I guess technically was an upset, although I thought he would win the fight when he came to Los Angeles and knocked out Jared Anderson very impressively. But the one thing about Adelier and about Coley is they're both, I guess, preparing for a fight on April, in April on the Boxer card. So I'm not sure how deep they are in their training for that fight because it's still a little bit away. But maybe those guys were more close to boxing shape because they had a fight scheduled than Martin is. But again, Martin, based on his track record and the way he looked in the last fight and just his sheer size and the fact that a lot of folks haven't really wanted to fight him, I think when I think about it, I feel like that's the best name of the guys that you mentioned that they could have gotten.
Dan, we're only a few days away now from what has been deemed as the biggest and greatest card ever in boxing. You've been in boxing a lot longer than I have. Is it that? Is it worthy of that title?
Yeah, I mean, it's up there. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to come up with something bigger and better. I think that from the point of view, maybe here in America, as great of a card it is, it doesn't have the kind of national notoriety, let's say, of some of the other big shows that were a lot more publicized to our part of the world. But if you take a look from the long view of the entirety of the sport, yeah, it's one of the biggest shows of all time. There's no doubt about that. And you'd be less than honest if you said anything otherwise. I know a lot of us like to point, myself included, many of the massive Don King pay-per-view cards that took place primarily in the mid to late 90s, some even into the early 2000s, starring fighters like Mike Tyson and Julio Cesar Chavez. And, he had a lot of cards like that. There was one card in Atlantic City in the early 2000s with 8 world title fights on it that included names like Bernard Hopkins and Hasim Rahman and Zab Judah and Ricardo Mayorga. I mean, and that was a loaded stack card also. But it's hard to argue. I mean, at least in terms of the last at least 20 years anyway, this is the biggest card that there's been in my mind in terms of the depth and the even nature of the matchups. And the only other ones, frankly, that it competes with are the other Riyadh season cards that have been put on over the last year and a half or so.
Let's get into the point of the contention at the top of the news, which sees Floyd Schofield exit his fight with Shakur Stevenson and Josh Padley enter in the opposite corner. So now it saw Floyd Schofield enter into the hospital as he felt unwell after, I believe, making a check weight, or at least attempting to make that check weight, and some accusations flying from the Schofield team outwards. But the bottom line is Josh Padley takes the opportunity. But what have you made of that situation that has led to that point?
I mean, it's unfortunate. Obviously, I mean, first of all, it's a great save by everybody involved in trying to make sure that Shakur still gets to defend the title. it's an incredibly a great opportunity for a young man like Josh Padley, who's coming off of his biggest win, where he was a huge underdog against Mark Chamberlain, who, coincidentally, or maybe because of the fact that he defeated the fighter that Turki Al-Sheikh had identified as his favorite fighter in Chamberlain. So he's coming off that victory that was in September on the big Riyadh card that was in Wembley when Anthony Joshua got knocked out by Daniel Dubois. So he was apparently training for another fight, in talks for a possible fight with Dalton Smith. They got the call on Tuesday night, and they felt like they're ready to go. So he takes his great opportunity. I think as we tape this on Wednesday, he's en route to Riyadh for this fight. And, he's playing with house money. He's there to, help save. He's not saving the show. The show still would have been a great show, even if that had lost that fight. But he gets incredible opportunity. Shakur doesn't have to waste the training camp and travel all that way to sit there and watch the other fights and not get the fight himself. So good job by everybody involved. And in terms of Schofield's situation, I haven't really just said what the reasons were, if it was a weight issue perhaps or some other thing. There were some wild accusations made by his father about somehow being, having Shakur's masseuse rub cream on his son, which he later recanted and said he apologized. That was not the case. So, they were filled with some conspiracy theories, if you will. The bottom line is the young man either was having trouble with the weight or just became ill. And I've been fighting a cold for a week. It's a normal thing these days right now in this time of year. So, wish him good health and see him back in the ring, and maybe he gets a shot down the road. But in the meantime, the show goes on.
Now, Dan, there's a couple of fights I want to hone in on, which include, of course, Beterbiev-Bivol 2 and Daniel Dubois' defense of his heavyweight crown against Joe Parker. But outside of those, going through all the fights would take up the whole day, such as the conversation and the nature of the card. But outside of those two fights, which fight do you think has the potential to steal the show?
Well, I think you have to take a look. Well, first of all the fights are interesting to me. I mean, honestly, the weakest fight on the show, and it's not like it was a terrible fight or anything like that, but when you're comparing it to the other 6 that it was competing against, Shakur against Schofield and now Shakur against Padley still is the weakest of the fights in terms of what the expectations would be for, let's say, entertainment value, competition. So it's a really outstanding show all around. But as you asked, as far as the fight that I'm looking forward to, that I think could produce the best action, be competitive and really interesting, as well as have, important stakes for the weight class, let's say, I think you have to look at, well, I'll say 2 of the fights. One is Virgil Ortiz against Israel Majmov. Really outstanding matchup at 154 pounds. Ortiz is undefeated. He's taken a tough fight again. He just, remember, he came off the fight with Boachuk that took place. That was a fight of the year candidate at the end of 2024. Really outstanding fight. And Majmov was supposed to fight Boachuk, but he had an illness. They put that fight off. He takes this fight instead. And even though he's got the loss that took place in August, he was in a really good competitive fight against Terrence Crawford. He gave Terrence Crawford maybe the toughest fight of his career. Lost his belt, but certainly, in my estimation, raised his stock with that loss. So I think anybody that looks at the matchup, I think they'd have to see a fight that looks like it's definitely competitive on paper between Majmov and Ortiz, and in the ring should be pretty good. And then the other fight that has really not gotten a lot of attention, but a really important fight for the heavyweight division, very interesting matchup also, and that's Zhilei Zhang taking out the undefeated Ajit Kabiel. It's for the WBC's interim vacant heavyweight title. I'm not really sure why they're doing that. There doesn't seem to be a need, but put that aside. Zhang has emerged as one of the top contenders in the last few years. He's had, a loss along the way, and Kabiel has been a revelation on these Riyadh cards where he keeps winning. So that's a good, interesting fight. And we all know that they call Zhang, a big bang Zhang because he's got big punching power. And, Kabiel's been knocking guys out also and looking good. So heavyweight, which is a division with a lot of stuff going on, combined with the fact that the Dubois Parker fight's also on the show, I think that fight also is very interesting.
Let's move on to the main event, which sees Artur Beterbiev defend once again against Dmitry Bivol to defend the undisputed light heavyweight crown for the first time, I should say, against Dmitry Bivol, having won it in their first fight. Look, this fight is a quick turnaround from the first one, but who do you think that favors?
That's a good question. I actually when I was writing some stuff about this fight leading up to it, I was looking at Beterbiev's record, and I realized that for the first time, you have to go all the way back to in the early part of his career in 2015, I believe, where he's had a turnaround of this close between his fights, where he's had a lot longer layoffs, which, sometimes is good, sometimes is bad, I guess, depending on what fighter you are. But certainly it's what he's used to. Now, some of that's been caused by injury, for example, but he's not used to returning in such a quick manner. Whereas Bivol has done it, maybe not in 4 months, but he certainly fought, multiple times per year for a long time. I guess if he's healthy, Beterbiev, I think for anybody, if you get back in there and you're good to go, that it doesn't really hurt or help either guy. Well, maybe it does help because you never had the opportunity to get out of any kind of shape in the first place. Certainly, if you're getting back in the ring that quickly, you're healthy. I believe that Beterbiev is the kind of fighter that if he wasn't at 100% or close to it anyway, that he wouldn't be doing the fight this quick. Bivol sort of the same thing. So I think it's kind of like, I don't know if it favors one guy or the other. It's kind of a wash. Like they're both in the same boat, if that makes sense. And, they know each other well now. Obviously, haven't gone 12 tough rounds against each other. They've seen the little tricks that each guy has. I know they respect each other's talents and abilities. And, my great hope for this rematch is that it produces a little bit more action. The first fight was a really interesting fight. It was technical, and it was a good boxing match, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. But it didn't provide the kind of action that I think was one of the reasons boxing fans tune into fights in the first place. So I can appreciate a good high level boxing match, but I would love to see it be maybe a little bit more fought at a higher pace and maybe just a little bit more action involved in it.
The overwhelming sentiment from the fallout from the first fight was that, with at least from Bivol's perspective, that the fight was lost in the final rounds. Do you feel that that's the key here for either man, that they really got to cement those final rounds to get the victory here?
I mean, I think that ultimately when you add up the scores, what cost Bivol was the fact that Beterbiev closed better. But the reality is it's a 12-round fight, and the first round is worth the same as the 12th round when you're adding up the math. So it's not, you always want to close strong if you think it's a close fight to make sure you get the benefit of the doubt. But I also would say is make sure you go out there and win the close first couple of rounds, because what happens sometimes, as fights go along, you might have like a real quiet round where not a lot's happening, and maybe one guy lands one or two decent shots and it's enough to shade the round. That 10-9 still counts the same when you add the math up. So, yeah, you want to close strong, but you want to start and you want to make sure you put all the rounds in the bank possible, especially in a fight where the likelihood is it's going to be competitive and close, and the judges are going to, maybe disagree on some rounds because of the way that the two styles match up together, where it's not cookie, it's not clear and obvious. There were at least, I would say 3 or 4 rounds in that first fight where you could not really get into a fight with somebody because you had it one way and they had it the other way. There was very close rounds in that fight. Go win the first round and go win the 12th round and everything in between. And don't let up, because the judges ain't going to do you any favors. So go out there and win them.
And some of the sentiment surrounding Dmitry Bivol's career has kind of always been that there's maybe an extra gear from him to come, but we haven't quite seen. And there was that feeling that when Bivol fought Craig Richards, he sort of fought within himself, and that got him the fight with Canelo afterwards. Having seen the first fight, do you still feel that there is that extra gear to come out of Bivol, or even Beterbiev, considering if maybe there was going to be a gear, you might have seen it in that first fight?
Yeah, I've always kind of felt that Bivol, as tremendous as a fighter as he is, pound for pound worthy, and is still a top fighter, has been for a very, very long time, that you do get the feeling that there are times where he might be able to pick up the level of his own intensity, or, as you say, find another gear. I do think that is possible. But I also think when you're fighting a devastating puncher like Artur Beterbiev, you better be careful when you're going to do that, because every time you throw that extra punch, you leave an opening, and you don't want to really leave a good opening for a fighter like Artur Beterbiev, who is a smart fighter and obviously a big puncher. That's sort of got to be, that's part of the strategy, is to make sure you want to land your punches, but you also don't want to take the punches when you're fighting a guy like Beterbiev. So yeah, I think he could raise it a little bit more. And one of the things that Dmitry has been saying in the lead up to this fight, I also spoke to him in the last few days, and the one thing he echoed, I mean, it must have been a half a dozen times in the interview, I need to do more. And by doing more, he means he needs to throw more punches. He needs to be a little more active. He needs to catch those judges' eyes. As you mentioned in that first fight, that is probably what cost him. It was that close of a fight. I personally scored the first fight a draw, and the separation was as close as you can get in a fight. So that little extra gear for both men could make a big difference come the rematch.
Well, either men, whoever stands to get the victory, how much life do you feel is left for them at light heavy? We heard Beterbiev potentially talk about a fight with Alexander Usyk at cruiserweight. We've heard that Bivol, I guess he might have a bit more life if he's talking about a Canelo rematch, even dropping down to super middle for it. But do you feel that they're destined to continue at light heavy for either of them if they do win?
Well, if Bivol is the winner, I mean, Turkey has already said he'd like to see a third fight. So I do think if it's another close kind of fight like we've seen in the first one and the second one is, of a similar level, that seeing a third fight between these guys would not be out of the realm of possibility. Bivol did mention to me, because he always is trying to motivate himself if he becomes the undisputed champion, what he would like to do is perhaps go for more belts. And he was talking about going to cruiserweight, where, look, he would be fighting in a cruiserweight division where he'd be the undisputed light heavyweight champion. You got like Jai Opetaia, who's the considered the champion, has the IBF title. There's also his possibility of fighting later in the year against Zurdo Ramirez to unify. And all of those guys have been associated with these Riyadh season cards. So either of those fights would be a possibility, I guess, for Bivol. Look, I don't know if the Canelo situation, how that's going to play out. Yeah, I mean, Canelo is the one that would want the rematch with Bivol based on the fact that he wants to avenge the loss. Now he's associated with Riyadh season also after doing his deal with Turkey. What those fights are going to take place beyond the two that we already know about, which is, of course, the William Skull fight in May, followed by September against Terence Crawford. Now, after that, if Bivol's still standing and is still interested, could Turkey perhaps put that fight together and make the rematch? Yeah, I guess that's possible, and Canelo would probably have to move up. I mean, I know Bivol says he can do it. I just have a hard time seeing him at this stage of his career of really embracing the notion of dropping down to super middleweight. Now, I guess he would probably do it because he wants belts, and it would be an opportunity, I guess, to become a super middleweight champion and collect a whole bunch of belts. But I think his future is probably more either at light heavyweight with other possible contenders, or potentially in the cruiserweight division where there are good opponents to fight, like a Zurdo, like a Opetaia, and others.
Well, Dan, I've run out of questions, but I'll leave you because there's so much, obviously, we haven't touched upon on any final thoughts that you wish to say. Once again, I'd like to say, too, if you want to see more of Dan Rafael's thoughts, you can find them at www.danrafael.substack.com, link in the description. But Dan, just floor is yours for any final thoughts if you'd like to give any.
It's going to be a long Boxing Day on Saturday. Let's put it like that. And it's this may sound. I'll leave you with this. I know this sounds like counterintuitive, maybe a little bit weird. I love the fact they put these great cards on where the fights are all 50-50-ish. You don't really know who's going to win. You expect good action. I wouldn't be the most upset guy in the world if they spread this out over two shows. Like give us like 3-4 great fights and then do 3-4 on the next show to give each one of these fights more time to breathe. And I say that because here we are spending time excited and talking about the build up to the show. And we didn't even talk about Buatsi and Callum Smith. And we didn't even talk about Carlos Adames' middleweight title defense against Hamza Shiraz. We spent like 30 seconds on Virgil Ortiz and Madrimov. My point is, you'd like to see the fights all get the proper attention. So I love the deep cards, but I wouldn't be opposed for this level of a show. Split it in two. Do 3 or 4 of these fights this month. Do 3-4 of the fights next month, and then they all get a chance to get their day in the sun.
Here we are talking about being sport and wanting to be less sport in boxing. What a world. Dan, much appreciated. Thanks for speaking to Seconds Out, and we'll catch you up again very soon.
You bet. My pleasure.